Welcome back to Coup Save America. Folks, today I stand before you to discuss a perspective that I feel is often overlooked in our political discourse. It is a perspective that critically examines the role of conservatism and the role of shaping the policies and social landscapes of the last 49 plus years. I assert that conservatism, in its most extremist forms especially, and through its influence, has been a driving force behind some of our nation's most challenging and detrimental policies that we have encountered, namely neoliberalism, the erosion of social institutions, the decline of unions, and the prevalence of at-will employment. Let's begin with neoliberalism. This economic philosophy, which gained prominence back in the late 20th century, essentially advocates for free market capitalism, deregulation, and reduction in government spending. While on the surface, these principles may seem to promote economic freedom and efficiency, their implementation has often led to increased inequality, corporate malfeasance, and a concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. Conservatism, with its emphasis on market freedom and limited growth intervention, has been a key proponent of neoliberal policies, often overlooking the societal cost of unbridled capitalism. But should we even expect conservatives to weigh the societal cost of anything, considering how conservatism directly targets our nation's social institutions? Conservative ideologies routinely prioritize individual responsibility over collective welfare. This perspective has led to a reduction in support for public institutions like schools, libraries, and community centers, which are essential for providing vital services. As a result, we've seen an increase in societal and social isolation and a decrease in civic engagement and a widening educational gap. Let's delve into a few statistics and data from studies to better understand this erosion of social institutions. First, we have funding for public government, education, and government, but mostly education here. Conservative policies often favor reduced government spending, which impacts public education funding. According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, 29 states were still spending less per student in the 2015 school year than they did before the recession. Reduced funding for public schools can lead to larger class sizes, fewer resources, and lower teacher salaries, all of which could contribute to a widening educational gap. Institutions that are increasingly under threat today include libraries and community centers. Libraries and community centers serve as a critical hub for community engagement and learning. The American Library Association reported that between 1999 and 2009, state funding for libraries dropped by nearly 38%, impacting their ability to serve communities, especially those in rural and low-income areas. There's also been a notable impact on social isolation and civic engagement. A study published in the Journal of Health and Social Behavior found a correlation between reduced investment in social institutions and increased social isolation, especially among older adults. At the same time, the National Conference on Citizenship reported a decline in civic engagement, including lower rates of volunteering and attending community meetings, again, particularly in areas with fewer community resources. There's been an educational gap and inequality. The reduction in funding and support for public schools has significant implications for education and inequality. The National Education Association highlights that schools in lower funded areas tend to receive less funding, leading to disparities in educational opportunities and outcomes. This, of course, contributes to a cycle of generational poverty and limits people's social mobility. Conservative policies often result in cuts to health and social services that are crucial for vulnerable populations. According to the Kaiser Family Foundation, states with conservative leadership have been more likely to reject Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act, limiting access to health care for low-income individuals. These are unconscionable. This has wider implications for public health and exacerbates health disparities. Next, let's look at the impact of conservative ideologies on the individuals whose efforts turn the gears of our capitalist society, the blue-collar employees. Unions have historically been crucial in securing workers' rights, fair wages, and safe working conditions. However, over the past several decades, we have witnessed a significant weakening of union power. This decline can be attributed in part to conservative policies that have favored corporate interests and championed right to work states. Conservative lawmaking introduces regulatory changes and challenges that make it more difficult for unions to operate and for workers to unionize. Take, for example, the National Labor Relations Board under conservative administrations has often taken stances that are less favorable to union activities. The resulting laws and policies have undermined the collective bargaining power of workers, leading to stagnating wages, widening income gaps, and less safe work conditions. Let's examine some key aspects and statistics and studies to further understand the impact of a failure to support unions. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, union membership in the United States has seen a steady decline. In the 1980s, about 20% of American workers were union members. By 2021, this number had dropped to approximately 10.3%. This decline is significant as it represents a reduction in the collective bargaining power of workers across various industries. And despite the positive sounding name of right to work laws, these laws actually only pretend to protect employees. In the 28 states that have enacted right to work laws, employers are prohibited from forcing their workers to join unions, pay union wages, and to cease working when union compels them to strike. While this sounds like it gives employees freedom of choice, it does so at their own expense. A study by the Economic Policy Institute found that workers in states with these laws have lower wages and fewer benefits compared to those in non-right to work states. Job sites in right to work states have higher accident and fatality rates, while at the same time, employees are less likely to be offered affordable health care insurance. Then we've got wage stagnation and income inequality. The decline of unions has collaborated in large part with corporations and has resulted in correlations with wage stagnation and growing income inequality. Research indicates that when weakening of unions, we also have seen a contributing factor to a larger share of income going to the top 10% of earners. A study by the International Monetary Fund found that a decline in unionization is associated with increase in income by up to the top 10%, thereby exacerbating income inequality. We've got deteriorating work conditions all around us. Unions have played a crucial role in advocating for safe and fair working conditions. With their decline, there has been a notable deterioration in those areas. A report by the American Journal of Industrial Medicine highlighted that unionized workplaces tend to have more rigorous safety standards and lower rates of occupational injuries compared to non-unionized workplaces. As if workers don't have enough to worry about without strong unions to back them, they must also contend with the problem of at-will employment. Now, this employment doctrine, which allows employers to dismiss employees for any reason without having to establish just or probable cause, reflects a conservative preference for minimal regulations in labor markets. While at-will employment offers flexibility for employers, it creates an environment of job insecurity and vulnerability for employees. This doctrine, influenced by conservative ideologies, can lead to exploitation, hinder advocacy for fairer workplace practices, contribute to wage stagnation, and negatively impacts, of course, mental health. The concept of at-will employment is a significant aspect of the labor market that warrants a closer examination. Let's explore this further with facts, statistics, and data from the following studies. Let's look at the prevalence of at-will employment. The US is one of the few developed countries that predominantly operates under at-will employment. Except for Montana, every state in the United States adheres to this doctrine. This widespread adoption is a reflection of the conservative preference for deregulated labor markets. We have job insecurity and volatility. According to the Economic Policy Institute, at-will employment contributes to job insecurity as employees can be terminated at any time for any reason, barring illegal reasons such as discrimination, genderism, sexism, ageism. This inability is not just theoretical. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics results reports that the median employee tenure is around 4.2 years, indicating a relatively high turnover rate in the workforce. At-will employment can hinder employees from advocating for better conditions or, more importantly perhaps, reporting unethical practices. A survey by the Workplace Bullying Institute found that about 19% of American workers have experienced workplace bullying. But the fear of job loss often prevents them from coming forward to report these incidents. This culture of silence can perpetuate unfair practices and worker exploitation. The lack of job security under at-will employment can contribute to wage stagnation. The fear of unemployment often discourages workers from negotiating for higher wages or better benefits. Data from the Pew Research Center shows that despite increases in productivity, real average wages in the United States have largely remained stagnant with 1970s levels. When compared to countries with stronger labor protections, the effects of at-will employment become more evident. For example, many European countries require employers to provide just cause termination. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, countries with stricter employment protection legislation tend to have lower turnover rates and less wage inequality. While conservatism is, as a philosophy, may offer certain merits in specific contexts, its influence over the past 49 years has contributed significantly to some of the most challenging policies of our times. The rise of neoliberalism, the decline of unions, the prevalence of at-will employment. These are interconnected outcomes of a conservative approach to governance and policymaking, an approach that often prioritizes economic interests over social welfare and individual rights over the collective good of society. As we move forward, it is imperative that we critically examine these policies and their long-term implications. We must engage in a balanced and nuanced discourse that considers not only the economic, but also the social and moral dimensions of our policies. It is only through such holistic consideration that we can hope to build a more equitable and just society. Today on Coup Save America, we are joined by a truly distinguished guest, Russell K. Jack Russell. Excuse me there. Russell comes to us with a robust background in law enforcement as a former US Federal Air Marshal, and I'll have some questions for him about that profession as well. He spent several years working up close with various security threats involving those posed by extremist movements within our own borders. And he's going to share some of those stories with us. Excuse me, this is kind of a difficult topic to talk about. We're going to be talking about how there's a infusion. Perhaps Russell would put this differently, but an infusion of law enforcement and military individuals that are engaging in what our guest today is going to call an act of terrorism. In his compelling and timely book, Is MAGA a Terrorist Movement?, Russell takes a hard look at the Make America Great Again movement, exploring its impact on our society and the very fabric of American democracy. Throughout his book, he lays out a meticulously researched argument, backed by his decades of experience in counter-terrorism, to classify MAGA as an extremist group that poses real and present dangers to our nation. With his deep insights into the workings of both governmental security operations and extremist ideologies, Russell offers a unique perspective on the rise of pseudo-patriotism and the resurgence of fascism in modern America. And I should also point out that we're seeing a rise in fascism across the world. We're seeing it in Germany, throughout parts of Europe. So it's not just happening in America. So, Russell, I want to first, before we introduce you and go to our first break, I want to thank you for joining us today to discuss your experiences and the critical messages in your book, which we're going to get to right after the break. And before we bring Russell on, I just want to let my audience know that I'm feeling a bit under the weather today, and I'm a little high on cough medicine, I think, cold medicine. So bear with me, please. Russell, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much, Sean. I appreciate having me on. And thanks for being here, even though you're sick. I appreciate it.
No problem. I really wanted to have this conversation with you. I read your book. I read it twice, actually. And I found the arguments to be very compelling. And of course, those in the audience might say, well, of course you would, because you're bringing them on as a guest to your podcast. So obviously you share a like mind. But I think that of all the discourse that we've had in this country over Donald Trump and the movement that he represents, I think we can kind of agree here that there's levels of extremism at work that the general public is just not talked to about. And that's one of the things that you talk about in your book, and that's the infiltration of MAGA ideologies into... Let me ask you this question first. Do you think that there is a infusion of MAGA supporters, or do you think that those people were always on a similar ideology and then Trump just came along to have that influence in law enforcement?
I think the answer is yes to both, but they're both contributing factors. Law enforcement, ever since I came on back in the 90s, has always had a conservative bent. It's always been, the liberals, they're all wimpy. And so they've kind of had, as a general group, a conservative lean. It never used to be a problem prior to 2016. We had people who voted Republican or they voted Democrat. And, sometimes we got what we wanted. Sometimes they did. Sometimes it met in the middle. And that's kind of how it's supposed to work. The concern is that the extremism that happened under Donald Trump and MAGA, starting in 2016, especially 2017, we started to see people, to include law enforcement and even counter-terrorists that I worked with, who supported a movement that was okay with using illegal methods that match the definition and intent of terrorism. The biggest concern I have with them is the use of that intimidation to achieve political goals. When you look at the definition of terrorism, it's anytime you're using intimidation or violence to achieve a political goal, especially if you're using it against the civilian population or the federal government or any government in the United States. And when you look at what MAGA has done and is doing, they meet the definitions and the intent of terrorism in addition to criminality. And so my concern has been seeing law enforcement supporting people who engage in criminal activity. I've had many discussions. I even had a podcast not too long ago with a much more Republican-leaning type of viewership. And one of the things I wanted to bring up with them, the host was like, well, you're calling half of America terrorists. Definitely not. I never say that in my book, and I never intend that.
Right. And actually, you go to great strengths to say the opposite of that, actually.
Correct. And the irony is that the host had not read my book. I really would like to have at least skimmed it. But the concern on that is I never said that. And my concern is this. She said, well, even if everything, went wrong, and even though this particular host didn't support MAGA, she said, well, if Donald Trump was a Republican nominee, I would vote for him. And that was when I said, well, we're not going to agree on this one. The fundamental problem comes in if the same exact things that were being done by MAGA and Donald Trump as a cult of personality, as the leader of that movement, were happening on the left. I would have the same book, except it would be about them and about them being on the left and doing it. The concern is illegal activity. The concern is especially illegal activity that's terrorism. And we're looking at a situation where their stated goal is to take over the United States government. I mean, there's no way to sugarcoat it. Their intent is to have one party in control with a powerful leader at top. And whether it's called a dictator or not, a one-party rule with a powerful leader is the definition of fascism. So that's my concern with MAGA. It's not an anti-Republican thing. In fact, MAGA has co-opted the Republican Party at this point, with Donald Trump as the nominee and with several powerful people in government, senators, congressmen, et cetera, either acquiescing to the movement or outright supporting the movement. You have a situation where not only did a self-coup attempt happen back in 2020, but now we're looking at a situation where they're okay with having that one party rule. And what makes America what it is today, as far as our freedoms, is the Constitution and our liberal democracy. One party rule works against our liberal democracy. And as we've already seen, they've done several things that violated the Constitution. I've had that argument. Perfect example, January 6th. The 12th Amendment is ratifying the votes. Nowhere in it does it say you can object. We had senators on the Republican side objecting, which is illegal. They're not allowed to do that. That's against the 12th Amendment. And obviously, the rioters attacking to stop the vote was against the 12th Amendment. So just going into the Constitution, if they took a real hard look at the Constitution, the Pledge of Allegiance, and listened to the words that were being said, they would realize that they're going against their stated goal of being pro-America.
Right. Why is that not obvious? I mean, is it obvious to them, do you think? Why, when I say them, let's clarify. There are those who support Donald Trump, and then there are the MAGA extremists that we're talking about with your book. Now, I would argue that it's hard to maybe be one without the other. If you're supporting Donald Trump, you're essentially supporting outright fascism. But I understand that that's a black and white version of thinking. So the people that we're talking about here, what percentage of this, the MAGA movement, as the general public might kind of define it as because there's a number of people out there that will believe that believe that all Republicans are this MAGA extremist faction, and I think it's very important, and you do such a great job in your book of making this distinguishment. Can you kind of make that distinguishment here as well?
Absolutely. I've actually talked with several Republicans who are very upset over the fact that the MAGA party has co-opted their party. If you look at their charter, I think it was Republican National Committee back in 2016, before Trump became president, it said the next president needs to support law and order by first obeying the law himself. So, I found it kind of ironic that when you look at their charter of law and order, they're supporting a group with a leader who is totally okay with breaking the law and using intimidation. So that's where we have the problem. And as far as Republicans go, they're in an unfortunate place. Their party has been effectively taken over by MAGA. And the problem you run into is there's probably a few thousand, and we know of at least a couple thousand people who are actively willing to use terrorism, like on January 6th. Then you look at how many people, according to polls, and I don't think many MAGA people would disagree with this, many millions supported what happened on January 6th. So we're looking at millions of people who actively support that terroristic behavior. Now, once you start talking about the Republicans in general, the entire party and all the independents who vote Republican, okay, which can be upwards, as we know, of 70 something million people last time. No, they don't all support terrorism. But the problem they run into is if the leader is going to be Donald Trump. Donald Trump has made very clear that there's many things he's willing to do that are not in our best interest for a liberal democracy. And he's going to encourage one party rule, especially with him in power and him being a powerful leader. The problem we run into is with that person being the only choice. We're in a two-party system now, so you can really only vote Democrat and Republican. So the problem for the Republican Party is we have people who are like, I don't like what the Democratic Party wants. I like what the conservative Republican Party wants. But here is the problem. If Donald Trump, and it looks very likely, is your choice for the Republican Party, and you have a choice between Biden and Trump, if you vote for Trump, you are voting for MAGA. MAGA and Trump are inseparable. MAGA and Trump engage in criminal activity that meets the definition of terrorism. So the problem is, whether you like it or not, if you vote for him, you are voting for those activities and that mentality. So yes, unfortunately, the problem is if you are voting for Donald Trump for the Republican Party at this point, with him as the nominee, yes, that vote will go towards a terrorist movement. It will. It's just simply math. It's unfortunate because our country has thrived on having that balance between conservative and liberal viewpoints, everybody voting and meeting in the middle. And unfortunately, especially since 2016, some would argue even long before that, we become very polarized. It's no longer working together. It's very much becoming an us versus them. But when the us versus them is us versus a group that's engaged in terrorism and is okay with creating a fascist government, well, I have to vote against them. Even if it was a liberal one and I didn't like conservatism, I'd vote Republican because I have to vote against a group that is willing to use criminal and terroristic means in order to achieve power.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I guess the question that I have is, we have this system of power in the United States. I mean, you've got the Electoral College, for instance, that's not very democratic. Did this not start? And I would argue that this started before Donald Trump even came on the scene, because we saw this man jump from one crisis to another crisis during his campaign. I mean, controversy after controversy, and yet people still in 2016 came out to support him, despite the it's not a sex tape, but the comment that's where he's talking about grabbing women by the what. These things would have once seemed, and they once did seem like, okay, how does he keep surviving this? This is unsurvivable.
So to answer that, in my book, one of the polls was showing that 88% of Republicans would vote for Trump, even if they had voted for another nominee, but Trump ended up being the nominee of choice for the Republican Party. 88% said they would vote for him. Over a third said that they supported, what happened on January 6th. And that's a very disturbing number. But to answer your question, I remember back when I was young, there was a reporter, I won't even say his name, and he faked being on scene. He faked being on set. He was in a helicopter and he pretended that he was somewhere he wasn't. And it ruined his career when the lie came out. Nowadays I had this discussion on our podcast about journalistic integrity. Okay, journalists, reporters, they all take that very seriously. Unfortunately, many of their employers, their agencies, news agencies, don't. So they're more into sensationalizing. They're okay with omitting data. And you look at articles that come out now and they're not even edited or spell checked. That was unheard of, 20, 30 years ago. So one of the things you were talking about is, prior to Donald Trump, we've seen our society more and more accepting of things that it never used to accept. The idea of a sexual scandal or being a criminal, even just the allegation of it, much less having being charged originally with 91 felonies from 4 different jurisdictions, it boggles the mind that anyone with that kind of criminal potential record would even be considered as a presidential nominee. I mean, if I would think, if you came forward and said, hey, look, I'm being investigated by 4 different jurisdictions, for scores of felonies, you would think that they'd be like, okay, I don't want you in charge anywhere in the government. In fact, I don't even want you as a federal employee. But that's the concern, is when I looked into this, it's scary. They don't have to have the security clearance standards like we do as agents or police or even just government workers. They don't have to play by the same rules. He can be a felon. He can be convicted and be a felon and become president, which I might blog on later. It could be quite interesting to see. Are we going to have like a Camp Rikers, where, hey guard, I need to see the president. I mean, how's that going to work? But the way the law is right now, yeah, you can be a felon. And in fact, after what happened with the 14th Amendment with the Supreme Court decision, they've effectively overturned Section 3 of the 14th Amendment because that states that you cannot be, and they go on a very long explanation in the Constitution, and there's only one Constitution, saying in any way, if you supported, aided, helped, acted in any form of insurrection, then you cannot work for the government in any capacity, any office. And a lot of people don't realize an office just means position. I had the office of a federal air marshal. I had the office of a federal police officer. Okay, there's the office of the presidency. So a person who has committed insurrection or has aided and abetted insurrection, which if you look at his activities, even if he hasn't been convicted on that, if you look at what happened, I think most people would agree that he has engaged in activities that would be considered insurrection. If I had done those things as a federal employee, I would have been fired. And that's what should happen here. He shouldn't be allowed to become that. But because of the Supreme Court, they've said the state cannot deny anyone being on the ballot for any federal position. Well, when we're talking about applying for Congress or when we're talking about trying to become president of the United States, that's with the state ballot. So what they're effectively doing is saying, okay, the state can't say no, but no one in the federal government is going to either. They even said, well, that's Congress's job. Well, Congress is legislative branch. They're not enforcement. And the only thing they can do is have an impeachment to vote someone who's currently a government employee out. It has no effect on somebody who's applying. And plus we saw they looked at all the evidence and said, yeah, he didn't do it for their own personal gain, in my opinion.
Yeah. I want to, this has been on my mind since yesterday when this interview was getting closer. There's a part of your book that really disturbed me. And it talked about you as a federal law enforcement agent. You were, I believe, at lunch with some other people, and there was a trans woman that was, correct? Yeah.
Correct.
That was sitting next to you. And can you share that story just so that we understand what we're talking about here and why this is a concern for?
Absolutely. One of the things that's very interesting about writing my book is I had a lot of consultation, not only with fact checkers to make sure everything was 100% correct, but also with legal. And it's important to know that, yes, I could have been much more specific about who the people were, even without giving their names. And I deliberately did not do that, but I wanted to share the story about our team being out there and what had happened. And I am proud of the fact that one of my fellow agents stood up with me to say, hey, what you guys are doing is wrong. And these, I don't even want to say microaggressions, aggressions. This isn't micro. There's nothing micro about it. These aggressions with a uniformed police officers saying these kind of things is completely unacceptable. And that's, of course, when the other agent and I got up and said, hey, you know, what you're doing is not okay. And for the listeners out there who haven't read my book, what had happened is some women sat down. One of them appeared to be transgender. And the men I was with who have that conservative viewpoint that MAGA shares, and they were MAGA members, okay? Not all of them, by the way, reacted this way, but some of them did. They started loudly saying things to the effect of, you know, it's so gross seeing a man trying to act like a woman and things like that. But they were deliberately saying it loud enough for the other party to hear, which is intimidation. And it's also illegal imitation. It's especially if it's under color of law like that. Now, are they going to get charged? No, but the perception it makes for us, we already have an image problem as it is. There's a lot of good police out there, good law enforcement, men and women that take everyone's rights very seriously, such as myself. I protect everyone. My personal viewpoint has nothing to do with it. My personal feelings on how someone acts has nothing to do with it. I'm there to protect them and to enforce the law, which is to protect them. So we both stood up and said, hey, you know, loudly to them, because they had been saying it loudly so other people could hear. We say, hey, what you're doing is unacceptable for a federal police officer, and it's unacceptable, you know, for a federal employee, and you need to stop. And they quieted down for a little bit, and then they kind of kept it going a little bit after that. So that's when we stepped away, you know, made sure they were safe and they were okay, and stepped away from our team. But these kind of behaviors are indicative of the problem we're going to have. And when people say I'm catastrophizing about how bad it can get, I'm not. The problem is if MAGA gets control, especially if we talk about the presidency and them getting a large amount of Congress, and they start making laws, which they can do without any voter input at that point. If you have a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress and you have a president that signs off on it, you can change every amendment. And we're also seeing ones like the 14th Amendment with SCOTUS, with the Supreme Court of the United States, where they're effectively overturning it by making it unenforceable. So the concern I have is when you have someone like me and other law enforcement that are like, hey, I'm going to protect everybody. Well, if they pass a law that says, okay, we're going to, I'm going to throw one out. We're going to pass a law that says any sort of homosexual activity in public is an arrestable offense. Okay, well, I'm not going to arrest them. Flat out, I'm not going to do it. Okay, but the problem is when you're talking about the people we were just talking about, they'll happily do that. And they won't see the disconnect in, hey, you're next. You know, how much further down the road before they decide some activity that you like to do is next on the chopping block. So we need to protect our rights and our freedoms. And part of that is protecting everyone's rights and freedoms. We're all Americans here in America, and we all protect each other. So if you're attacking any one group, of us, you're attacking all Americans, especially when you're talking about our freedoms and our Constitution. And that's where I think the big difference is looking at MAGA versus saying it's a political argument. It's not a political argument. It is a criminal argument. We have a group of terrorists, domestic terrorists, and supporters millions of people who support their activities. And that's a huge problem. No other terrorist organization, especially foreign terrorist organization, has any real chance of taking over the United States of America. But being taken over from within can happen, definitely.
Given the current makeup of our government, let's not even talk about the polls. Do you think that? How likely do you think that? I keep saying that it looks like we're going to have a civil war, and when I say that to people, I mean random terrorist acts just kind of occurring as a frequent disruption. I mean, I don't see us having a civil war like the Civil War was, but I do see something where mass disruption is possible through these, individualized lone wolf, if you will, terrorist attacks that could happen. Given the current makeup of our government right now, I believe Mitt Romney, who is someone who has spoken against Trump many times, made the comment that if he were president, he would pardon Donald Trump. That's again coming from Mitt Romney, someone who has before spoken out against Trump and who has presented himself up to this point, at least, as somebody who did not support Donald Trump. Given that someone like him at this point would even say, well, I would pardon Donald Trump, how screwed are we kind of as a country?
That's one of the things that's my concern is I've had individuals say to me before, you're making a big deal out of nothing. That's not really their intent. Well, when you look at the things that Donald Trump, who is the leader of MAGA, has openly said, he said, hey, I'm going to pardon all the people who are involved in January 6th. So we're talking about hundreds of terrorists being released back out. He's already said, hey, I want to make civil service employees, which is tenured government employees, no longer have that protection. And the reason for that is because he wants control. He wants to be able to say, well, if you don't do what I say, I'll fire you. And that's why we have the civil service system we do in the federal government, is so that they can't come to you and say, hey, I need you to go arrest that guy. Don't ask any questions. And if I say, no, I need to know why, then they say, okay, you're fired. Well, that puts me in a position, or when I say me, I'm saying any employee in the government, that puts that government employee in a position where they no longer have fealty to the Constitution and to the United States government and to the people, but they have it to that leader or that group. That is a very dangerous place for our society to be in. So to answer your question about Mitt Romney pardoning him, I think that's a terrible idea. And the reason why is if it was Joe Biden, which of course it isn't, but if he had 4 different jurisdictions and 91 felonies coming at him, I'd be like, my God, yeah, definitely go after this person, And I've heard a real common thing is projection and deflection, which is projections just saying, hey, we're not the fascists, you guys are. I've actually seen that where they say the Democrats are the fascists. And then when I confront them and I say, well, do you know what a fascist is? They have no idea. Or you talk to them, you've seen the videos where they ask them questions about the Constitution. Now, can I answer what all 27 amendments are off the top of my head? No, I can't. But I can answer what quite a few of them are. And many of these supporters who are supposedly super huge pro-American patriots can't even answer some of the most basic constitutional questions. So we're in a situation now where we have a very large amount of people supporting a group that's okay with creating fascism. So my concern on that is, you start talking about pardons, look at the behaviors. They're openly saying what they're going to do. It's not like they're hiding it. They're telling you, hey, these are the activities we're going to engage in that are wrong. So anyway, I hope that answered your question. Okay, Sean.
Yeah, it does to an extent. I guess what my feeling is that we've already lost this battle.
No, we haven't. My concern, like you said about the Civil War thing, I've heard people say the same thing before, like, well, we're going to have a civil war if he doesn't. No. And when you get to the point where you're watching your children die of famine, that's when you have a revolution. When you're worrying about how you're going to pay for your cell phone plan or your second car, that's not the kind of person who's going to go out and risk going to prison. One of them said to me on a podcast, well, hey, if they were serious, then how come, we're big Second Amendment people, how come more of them didn't bring guns and it didn't turn more violent? And I'm thankful that it didn't. But the real answer is lack of commitment. And I certainly don't encourage them to be more committed. Okay. But in all honesty, that answers your question. I don't feel that when November comes around, they will say, if Trump doesn't win, they will say fraudulent election, this is fake, we won't accept it. They've already said they're going to say that. Now, of course, if he wins, then it was a valid election, of course. Right. But if he doesn't, they'll recheck all the states he lost, not all the states, which is my problem. If you really think there's fraud, check everything. But there isn't. Okay, it's this last election was probably one of the most vetted elections of all time. But they're going to say, yes, we're going to push for the Civil War, and we are going to see some uptick in violence and in illegal behavior, but we're not going to see anything like you said on the level of what happened in the 1800s. That's not going to happen.
Right. Yeah. I mean, again, I see it as more sustained terrorist activities. And we've already seen bombs sent to the media, placed outside party headquarters. And fortunately nothing significant came of that, although the gentleman that sent the bombs to journalists, he was eventually captured, but that was only simply by divine intervention, if you will, that something didn't happen, given that these were actual devices that were sent. So that's kind of what I envision. But where I feel defeated is that, given again the current, look up the majority of the Supreme Court right now. People that Donald Trump put in there that want a version of Christian nationalism to overtake this country. There's a lot of Republican politicians in Congress that feel that had that same drive. We covered on the show, I believe it was last year, something called Project 2025. Are you familiar with that at all?
I've heard it. I haven't looked it up at this point, but I have heard of that. It's basically their declaration of what they're going to plan to do once they get in power.
And they do plan. You used an example earlier in our discussion to say, well, if law enforcement were directed to, if you're homosexual, then, that's a crime. Project 2025 outright says that. They want to define them as sexual deviants by definition. And again, this is in their own project, in their own words. It's not being taken out of context. It's right. Exactly what they're saying. It's hard to imagine that happening, just because it's just so insane and frightful. But if you look at the Supreme Court, if you look at Congress, I have very little faith in the institutions to actually keep us safe.
I can understand that. Looking at what's happened already, you can already see that they have been doing that. We have books being banned in Florida. We do, like you said, have things being pushed towards Christian nationalism. And one thing I've always found interesting when I've had this discussion in the past with people who believe that way, and I said, well, wait a minute, how's this okay? And they're like, well, it's fine because of this and this. I'm like, wait a minute. The litmus test is always, let's turn it around. Let's say, you know what, I'm going to pass extremist Muslim philosophies and I'm going to make it illegal to be a Christian. They would be up in arms. That's a violation of the First Amendment. Well, it is also a violation of the First Amendment to tell someone it's illegal for them to be gay. Okay. You're interfering with many constitutional things: freedom of movement, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. There's all sorts of things that are protected in the Constitution that they're going after. And the fundamental problem is, if you want to try to push your agenda, do so legally. And by doing that, it won't allow it to be unconstitutional. But the problem is, like you said, that's so scary, is we have a 6-3 supermajority of conservative versus liberal. And we've already seen some of the actions that have happened from that. And my concern is, as these machinations get further and further along, you have more and more people in high levels of government, such as Congress, President, Supreme Court, the main three branches. You start seeing this consolidation of power. This is what our forefathers wanted to avoid. Okay. I don't want the Democrats having one party rule with a powerful leader at top either. So we need to fight. Obviously, I always have to say this, legally, not violently. Okay. But we need to be adversaries against the people who are trying to destroy our Constitution and our freedoms and our liberal democracy. And as you were saying, our way of life. basically the basic concept for the United States that I learned ever since I was young was you're allowed to do anything you want as long as you're not harming others. So yes, some topics can get extremely touchy, the whole pro-choice versus pro-life thing, depending on how it's looked at. Okay, but other ones not so much. Freedom of religion is also freedom from religion. You're not allowed to pass any part of your religion, of which going after LGBTQ would be that. So you're not allowed to force your religion down someone else's throat or any part of it, any religion. So that's part of it, is you're free to practice Christianity. You're free to practice Islam. You're free to practice Hinduism. You're allowed to do all that. But what you're not allowed to do is force others to have to follow the dogmas and principles of those religions. And that's true even if, as I discuss in my book, it's true even if they just pass it in piecemeal. The First Amendment isn't an all or nothing. It isn't, hey, Christianity is the law of the land. We'll stone you to death if you don't follow what we say. Just these pieces, these chinks in the armor, as they pass them, will get bigger and bigger. So yes, to answer your concern, is the problem is if MAGA gets considerable control of the government, especially if they get full control of the government, we're going to start seeing more and more of these laws being passed that infringe on our freedoms.
Well, I would argue that again, we've already seen this. We've seen laws. You mentioned earlier about homosexuals and part of the Constitution limiting their movement. We've got states now saying if you leave our state to get an abortion, we will come and get you for that crime,
which is unconstitutional.
But we're talking theoreticals here. I mean, unconstitutional. You and I understand what that means, but Supreme Court is the ultimate decider as far as our freedoms and liberties are concerned. If they say no, it's not.
That's the scary part about it. Like the 14th Amendment, Section 3, that they basically negated by saying states can't enforce it, even though they're the only ones that can when it comes to those ballots for federal positions through the state, right, such as the presidency and the Congress and things like that. So there's also in the 14th Amendment, Section 1, if I remember correctly, is where freedom of movement comes into play. And what it basically says is that unless those freedoms are taken away by the Fifth Amendment, in other words, you've been successfully charged and convicted, okay, unless that occurs, you're free to go wherever you want in the United States. If I leave Colorado to go to Kansas, I don't expect to be stopped at the border with a police officer saying, hey, what's your business before you come to Kansas? I'll be like, none of your business. I'll keep on driving. They have no right to stop me as I go from one state to another, any more than they have a right to charge me for something that's legal in the state I'm currently in, even though it's illegal where I'm residing. Okay. And if you think about how ridiculous it is, what you were talking about earlier about the separation of wealth in our country. Okay. If I want to do something that's illegal in the state of Florida or the state of Alabama, and I'm wealthy, all I do is just become a resident in a different state. Okay. What it's doing is it's going after the people who don't have that freedom, who don't have enough money to just have two different states or to just pick up and leave and go somewhere else. And that's the problem, is if they decide to leave from Texas to come to Colorado for an abortion, or as I explained, go from Kansas to Colorado to use marijuana, that in and of itself should not be a crime. Now, if they are bringing that marijuana back into that state where it's illegal, yes. If they are doing an abortion in a state where that's illegal from a criminal standpoint, yes, they're in trouble. Do I agree with that? No. But that's the way law works. But what is wrong is the 14th Amendment's very clear, if I remember correctly, it was the 14th Amendment, on freedom of movement that says, hey, no, you can't tell someone you can't go to another state and do something. They definitely can. So.
Yeah. Again, it's very defeating to look at the political and legal, at this point, landscape in this country right now. And most polls show that Donald Trump has a significant lead in the states that matters with the Electoral College. Republicans hold a majority in the House right now. And who knows what the Senate will look like after the election. That looks like it could potentially flip too, because there's such a slim majority right now. Who's to say that even if Donald Trump doesn't get elected, that these institutions that we're seeing that have been taken over I mean, if the House stays in Republicans, if the Senate flips to Republicans, I mean, they can still do a lot of damage even without their figurehead at the top.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things where not having the figurehead, if he does not get the presidency, that will go a long ways towards helping us slow down and defeat the effects of MAGA. If he does get elected, especially if they have a large amount in Congress, they take over the House and the Senate, we're in trouble, and it'll happen very quickly. And that's what I think a lot of people don't realize is this erosion of these freedoms is going to affect everybody. And even the people on the right who are like, oh, I love what they're doing. I'm just so glad this party's in control. Well, then when all of a sudden they start saying, yeah, I'm going to pass this law. And all of a sudden they're like, wait a minute, I don't like that. There'll be nothing they can do about it. So fascism is never a place anyone wants to be. Even if, like in my book I mentioned, even if you look at like what Nazi Germany was, even if you're like the highest level Nazi person, SS, and I know it's cliche to use that as an example, but it is true. In a fascist government, you always have to fear the government. Even if you're one of the federal employees that they like, you have to worry, do I say or do something they don't like? Or even did somebody say that I did? Like these teachers in Florida. Not only do they have to watch out about what they say and do so they don't get fired for daring to bring up anything about LGBTQ, but the mere allegation of it, a kid goes home, tells his parents, and says, hey, my teacher said this, they can be in fear of losing their job over that.
And this Project 2025, in fact, goes even further and says that it talks about teachers and what they can introduce, and it talks about criminalizing these things. So not only lose your job, but lose what freedom you actually have.
Correct. And I think the biggest takeaway here is that when people say, oh, I support MAGA, you say, okay, well, do you support Al-Qaeda? Do you support Al-Shabaab? And they say, well, no. I'm like, why not? They also, have a violent, terroristic way of accomplishing their means. So why is it any different? You should applaud them. And they say, well, that's not true. I'll be like, well, it is. You're using crime, you're using terror, you're using intimidation, and you're doing illegal and unconstitutional things to try to force your will on others in America. And that's not how our system's set up. So for me, it's always been very easy. I like to get away from people saying, oh, we're in a very politically charged environment or it's politics. It's not politics. It was politics when it was Republicans and Democrats. Now that it's MAGA and Democrats, no. Because as long as Trump is their leader for the Republican Party, the nomination for that is the party. The party is MAGA. I mean, if you look at it quite literally, he's in charge. He's MAGA. His supporters, his base are MAGA. So we're talking about an outsized influence by this group if they get into power. So for me, it's a very simple equation. It has nothing to do with Republican and Democrat. If the roles were flipped and it was Democrats doing all these things, I'd be on your podcast right now talking the same way about them. It isn't, obviously.
What percentage do you think, because an argument that people will make is, well, and I'm sure you've heard this probably yourself, is, well, you're taking it too far. You're not having enough faith that the institutions in our so-called, liberal democracy, you don't have any faith in the institutions. The institutions will take care of it. And they'll say, look at the examples where, the things that the Supreme Court, for instance, has refused Trump. I mean, he's made a lot of legal arguments to the Supreme Court for his, criminal indictments. And they've either rejected them outright or refused to hear the case at all. How do you respond to someone that makes that argument that, well, what you're talking about, the worst case scenario can't happen because we've got all these built-in, protections in place?
I would say the first thing I would say to them is look at what just happened with the Supreme Court, where they said the 14th Amendment can't, you can't tell an insurrectionist, and this is if somebody was convicted of insurrection, not just sedition and conspiracy, but actually convicted of the much more difficult to successfully charge insurrection violation, of criminal violation. If somebody was actually convicted as an insurrectionist, came out on probation, had a felony record, they could become president of the United States. And That's wrong. So they're telling the state, you can't refuse him being on the ballot. I realize he's out on probation for being an insurrectionist, my hypothetical example, and I realize he's a convicted felon, but you can't stop him from being on the ballot. And he has a large base that supports this particular person, and next thing you know, they're president. When we look at the checks and balances of our government and say, well, that's not going to happen. Well, one of the very things that they're talking about is saying, well, it's Congress's job to stop that. Well, look at what happened in Congress. Right after this happened on January 6th, many Republicans said, yeah, we need to impeach this guy. But by the time they got around to vote, because politicians were rewarded for personal power, they didn't want to anger their base. We saw what happened with Liz Cheney and the 10 Republicans that did the right thing and said, hey, looking at all this evidence, this is very much a impeachable offense. I vote to impeach. Any reasonable person looking at the materials, the data, would come to the same conclusion. I mean, this isn't a political thing. This is just from an outside perspective. If you were just looking in, you weren't part of a political party, you weren't even from this country, and you said, okay, what happened? What's your law? And what are the elements of the crime? And you looked at it, you'd say, yeah, that's definitely an impeachable offense and he shouldn't be president. But what happened is, in that interim, before they actually did the vote, many of them realized, if I do this, the base for the Republican Party is MAGA, and I'm going to anger them, and they're going to primary me out. They're going to get somebody else in to do a primary, and then they're going to take over my job. Whereas if I just play along, and that's where the scary part about fascism is. It isn't just the diehard millions that are supporting it or the thousands that are actively terrorists. The problem is when you get tens of millions of people behind it that say, hey, I'm going to vote for him anyway. Or, hey, yeah, they do some things I don't like, but it's okay if we have fascism as long as it's fascism on my side. And that's, I think, the scary part we're looking at is that this breakdown in the checks and balances of the government has already been happening, and it's been accelerating. We have, people in Congress that were saying, hey, this guy didn't do an impeachable offense, when it's clear to everyone he did. Even if you're MAGA, even if you're a Republican, even if you like the guy, nobody can look at that with an objective eye and say he did not do an impeachable offense. I mean, clearly, if I'd been on duty in uniform and doing the things he did, I wouldn't have a job. I would lose my job. I'd go to jail and I couldn't be a federal employee anymore. So the idea that he can become president after everything he did is mind-boggling.
Do you think that he'll be convicted of any of the cases that's before him now?
I do. What's scary is if he becomes president, and especially if there's enough control, they can do machinations to effectively block a lot of those convictions. Certainly the federal charges they can make go away. And we've already seen, how one particular judge delayed the trials till well after the election, unnecessarily, in my opinion. But my concern is this, is I think that there's an extremely high chance that he will get convicted. One of the things I like to say, if I'm ever in a jury and they say, can you be objective? And I'm like, yeah, but you don't want me. And I'm like, well, why not? Because probable cause means that you have probable cause to believe that a crime was committed and that person committed it. Well, that's what they have to arrest you in the first place. And no prosecutor is going to want to lose their case. So what they want is an overabundance, an overwhelming amount of evidence showing guilt, meeting all elements of the crime. So the fact that you have 4 different jurisdictions, and at the time, I realize some have been let go at this point, but at the time it was 91 felonies that he was charged with. Anytime you're talking about that large of a number, if you allow justice to go full course on it, I think it's extremely unlikely that all those counts would come back not guilty because the evidence just isn't there. But that's the thing about America. He needs to be convicted. I'm glad we're in a society where simply the accusation is good enough. I'm glad that's not America. In order to be convicted, you need to be convicted in a court of law. Now, as far as being impeached or not voting for that person, I can't imagine voting for somebody who is charged with 91 felonies to be president of the United States. To me, that's just insane.
What do you think of the polling right now showing this lead that he has? And again, this is in the states where, it matters the most with the Electoral College. But again, just the people, he is the nominee at this point. They haven't had the official nomination convention yet, but right. He is essentially the nominee. And he has a fairly good shot of taking back the White House.
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book and why I'm pushing out the message. It's a real concern. I've had people say to me, "Well, what do you think the percentage chance is?" And the analogy I gave was it's not a percentage. It's a battle between us versus them. And when I say us, what I'm referring to is people who don't support terrorism and fascism. So, which includes many Republicans who do not agree with MAGA either. But the concern is that we have our founding fathers made an imperfect system. I doubt they even expected the great experiment to last 2.5 centuries almost. The concern is, like you said, the Electoral College is very flawed. I imagine they put it into place because at that time, with a much lower population, states were concerned, understandably, that they wouldn't get equal representation without a Senate that's set up with 2 representatives from each state. Unfortunately, if you look at other countries around the world, some very successful, it is a much more efficient to just simply have a mass vote. Did 50.1% vote for it? It's the law. I mean, unless it's unconstitutional or the Supreme Court says, no, you can't do that. That's a much better system. But unfortunately, we have what we have, and we have the Electoral College. So that, unfortunately, is a mechanism that allows, between the Electoral College, the gerrymandering that goes along with that, where they try to redline districts so they can get a favorable outcome. You can get a situation, especially when you start talking about the breakdown of our liberal democracy and our checks and balances in government. Once you see all these things happening at once, you can get a minority of people, as in a less than majority, okay, a minority of our people having outsized control over the majority of the population that doesn't want that. And that's my concern, is I think most people, if you just asked them, hey, do you mind if I take away some of your constitutional rights? Almost all of them would say, yeah, I mind. You can't take those away, even if you went to MAGA and said that. But then when you tell them, hey, here's some amendments that you've already violated and that you're looking to get rid of, and then say, oh, that's not true. But then you tell them, here's what the amendment is, here's what you're doing, and here's how it violates it. Then all of a sudden they tune out. Because that's one of the problems I noticed is I had the radio host before say, well, have you talked to, regular people, as if law enforcement isn't regular people, but either there or there. So, but when you do talk to them, they're very close-minded. They only listen to right-wing media news sources. And one thing I like to push out is, hey, listen to all the relevant facts. If something sounds wrong, go look into it, right or left. And that's my concern too, with the media too, is I want to see that fact checking. I want to see, you see it much more on the left than the right. The right's rewarded for allowing people to say things that are either misguiding or outright untrue, a lie. Whereas on the left, if they do that, they tend to get fact checked by other news agencies. Now, I'm not saying it never happens, but I'm saying they're much, much better checked on the left than on the right. And we're willing to listen to both sides. But the problem is when I hear facts being told me that are proven to be untrue, and I point that out, they say, well, where'd you get that information? And as soon as I point out anything that isn't a right-wing media source, they're like, oh, well, that explains it. You heard wrong. And so unfortunately, they're in a situation where they're following a cult of personality. And unfortunately, just like a lot of other fascist movements, that's how they start. Donald Trump is a very charismatic person. He's tens of millions of people are following him as MAGA members, identified as MAGA members. Most people don't identify as Republican or Democrat. They say I vote that way. So when you start seeing somebody saying I am MAGA, that's a concern.
I also want to point out that Justice Alito recently, it's come out, had flown his flag upside down during the last election, presidential election, where Trump lost.
Thank you for being. Welcome to the Big Ale Podcast.
We're going to take a break.
I'm Josh, and I know that I know nothing.
Sounds good.
So I created this podcast to help awaken.
Okay, we're good. Sorry about that, everyone. Sorry about that, Russell. Oh, I think you might be muted.
Got me muted.
Oh, here we go. Okay.
There you go.
Okay, sorry about that, everyone. next show is about to start, and for some reason, that was just weird. Okay, I'm sorry. Where were we?
I'm trying to remember that. That thought one threw me off. So I'm trying to remember what we were last talking about.
I think. Well, we were talking about
Justice Alito. I remember you mentioning that.
Yeah. And
flag upside down.
Flag upside down. And I suppose I have to say, disclaimer, I suppose there could be some other explanation for it. But when you have a justice that, and this is someone that Trump did not appoint, you've got to hear again is another institutional authority that seems to be implying that they are outright supporting fascism, and these people are already in place without their figurehead. It just seems like even without Donald Trump, and I would argue that Ron DeSantis is just as dangerous as Donald Trump. I mean, just a matter of personality, not being as charismatic. In some ways, I think DeSantis would even be more of a threat simply because I think he's more competent, whereas Donald Trump at least is incompetent. It still feels that we have lost a lot of this balance, the balance here on this end, because we have these right-wing authoritarian figures that are already in positions of extreme power. In the case of a Supreme Court justice, I mean, that's a lifetime position. I suppose with other institutions, we have some recourse through the criminal justice system or Department of Justice, but it also concerns me, and this is what I find most disturbing about your book, is, and I guess the only way to ask it is to really outright ask it, and that's what percentage do you think Trump or the MAGA side has of law enforcement and the military?
So I've actually answered this one before in other places, and this is the scary part about it. I think that you would find that it's still a minority of officers, agents, federal employees, military that are pro-MAGA, that are 100%. Hey, I'm for them. January 6th was great. I'm all for everything they're doing. I'm all in. The problem we run into is because of that conservative bent. We go into what I talk about in my book about tribalism. And the problem you run into is when you get a cult of personality combined with tribalism and co-opting, you start turning national symbols like the flag into a symbol for MAGA instead of for the United States. And you start seeing police officers and government agents and military, a small but significant group of them saying, hey, I'm for this movement. But the problem is, because we already have this conservative bent, what I encountered, especially during my last 6 years as an agent, is that you had a significantly large group that was pro-MAGA, and then you had another even bigger group that was intimidated into either following along or, pardon my French, shutting up. So they were silencing them, because the problem you ran into is there was a minority of us. It was definitely less than half. There was a minority of us that were like me that said, wait a minute, what you're doing is wrong. You're supporting illegal actions as a law enforcement officer. You're enforcing terroristic actions as a counter-terrorist. And you're going against the will of the American people and trying to go after their freedoms and their constitution, their protections. And that's just wrong. That's what you were sworn to defend against. So to answer your question on the percentages, I would say it's less than half that are pro-MAGA, but significantly more than half that will stay silent about it and go along and be quiet. So the problem we're running into is when you have a majority of people that either follow it and support it or acquiesce to it, you now have a large enough base that when these laws start changing, they're going to start getting enforced. And that's the scary part, because what will happen, especially if you overhaul the civil service system and make it where you no longer have career status at 3 years, okay, then what happens is someone like me says, hey, what you said against that transgender woman was completely unacceptable. How dare you? And let's say, that goes up the chain, and the supervisors, in this case, maybe some of them are MAGA, okay, because there are supervisors that are pro-MAGA. And one of them says, you know what, I'm just going to fire us. Problem solved. Now it's an even larger group, and the people willing to talk becomes even smaller because they see what happened to me. And so now you have a tiny number of people willing to say something and act out on it. And that is when tyranny and fascism takes over completely. And the problem is that can happen very quickly once they get control. We've seen that. History shows it. It doesn't take long. And it has to do with how much power they have. So the more power that they get, the quicker this is going to happen. So our best bet is voting, obviously, calling them out for the things that they're doing wrong, and really getting the message out to a lot of people. I think a lot of people are understandably concerned with domestic issues. They're concerned with inflation. They're concerned with their jobs, with making money, with the S&P 500. They're concerned with all these different things, but they're not. I think a lot of people don't realize just how close we are to starting down the road to fascism. I'm not saying, Donald Trump gets elected, we're automatically a fascist government, instantly. No, but the problem is we're going down that road. I mean, banning of books, unheard of. We've never heard of such a thing. And the impeachment. I mean, if you look back at Clinton, okay, and what he was impeached for, and the whole thing that came of that, and how he was like, oh my, it was close on whether or not he was going to get to stay president. You had Nixon, who resigned over Watergate. Well, he's probably rolling in the grave. It's compared to what's going on now with the Trump campaign. That was a drop in the bucket, and yet it ruined the career.
I believe the presidential library for Nixon had to, at one point during the Trump administration, come out and say something very similar to that. Like, don't use Nixon as an example.
Yeah, exactly. But that is the scary part about it.
Yeah.
Is things that used to be automatic disqualifiers are now accepted by people, and I disagree with that. If I had a Democratic person, they came out and said, "Hey, he did this horribly wrong thing," even if it wasn't criminal, if he just did something really, really immoral and wrong, that would definitely be something that worked against them as far as consideration for voting for them. And that's a problem we're looking into now. When you have, according to one poll, over a third of registered Republican voters that say, yes, I think more highly of him, that he's been charged with multiple felonies. That, to me, that's the scary part, is that we have enough people in our society that are willing to look past criminal behavior to get what they want. And that's what we need to stop. So that's kind of the reason for the message, is to let people know this is more of a threat than a lot of people realize.
What would you say to people that, and I'm sure, again, that you've been accused of this, that say that, well, calling a MAGA terrorist is a version of extremism that jeopardizes too much?
Well, I would say the same answer would be like, well, I mean, would they feel that way if I said that about Al-Qaeda? And, they were just trying to get us out of Islamic lands. They're not even trying to take over our government. So the idea that, and yes, I have been accused of that. One thing I find interesting is what I talked about before, that projection and deflection. The projection is saying, oh, we're not fascist, you are, and deflection is saying, well, wait a minute, don't worry about Trump. What about Biden? And my answer has always been the same. If there's criminal behavior going on, arrest them, charge them. And if the jury says they did it, convict them, put them in jail, no matter who they are, no matter what side of the spectrum they're on politically. But that's where I'm getting scared, is that, you have people who are openly doing criminal activities and they're still being supported. There's no way I would support, even if it was somebody who matched every one of my values and is my perfect candidate. If they're like, well, I'm your perfect candidate, but I got to let you know, I'm currently under investigation. I've been charged for multiple felonies. No, I'm not going to vote for you. That's what the reaction should be. And that's what it used to be, because we don't have to have Donald Trump. We have Donald Trump as the Republican nominee because of MAGA and because that party has been taken over by that group. Normally, if it was just the Republican Party, which it no longer is, according to its old charter of law enforcement and law and order, if we had that kind of environment, it wouldn't be a big deal. Okay. If my favorite Democrat has some horrible thing comes out about him and it's like, oh boy, I don't want that guy, well, they're off. And the next person steps up and goes, okay, I'm the nominee now. That's how it's supposed to work. So what's scary to me is the idea that you have a person who's openly okay with criminal behavior or openly okay with people who perform those criminal behavior for him. And of course, I have to say alleged. We're in America. We have lawyers. So, my opinion and alleged, of course. But you see these activities, which are criminal and terroristic in nature, and they're not only not being enforced, but they're being encouraged. And that's what's unacceptable. I would never support anyone who did that, no matter what their political bent.
So to go a little further into that, Can you maybe define what characteristics of the MAGA movement align with, for instance, Al Qaeda or other terrorist organizations out there?
Absolutely. The biggest thing is, when I talk to people like the January 6th thing, how come it wasn't more violent, et cetera? If I go rob a bank and I do a really terrible job of it, I don't hurt anyone, I don't bring a gun, okay, and I just do a really terrible job of robbing the bank, I still am a bank robber, okay? It's the same thing with January 6th. It was still an insurrection. It was still a riot. It was still a self-coup, and it was still attacking the 12th Amendment of the Constitution. I mean, not to mention attacking over 100 police officers. Okay, so all of these things go 100% against the Republican Charter. So my concern with MAGA as a terrorist movement is the same as with Al Qaeda. Anytime you have an organization that is willing to engage in criminal behavior that is intended to intimidate, coerce, and harm others for a political purpose, especially against the civilian population and especially against the government, that is terrorism. So we saw that with Al Qaeda. Okay, we saw that on 9/11. We saw that on January 6th. That's what that was. That was a domestic terrorist attack on the United States of America. Now, I've had people argue and say, oh, that wasn't a domestic terrorist attack. Well, look at the definition of terrorism. Okay, it's a domestic group. This is the definition of terrorism I just said. Did their activities meet that definition? Yes. Was their intent that definition? Yes. So they are no different. So any organization that uses terrorism, which by default is illegal, we're not just talking crimes. I mean, you can have somebody come in and shoot a bunch of people and they're still a murderer, but it isn't necessarily terrorism. The difference is the intent. So the intent of the MAGA group is to gain political power through this intimidation, this fear, and this harm. And we've seen it in death threats. We've seen it in attacks. We've seen it surrounding the Biden bus. And we have many, many examples of this illegal activity that pursues the goals of terrorism. So the short answer is they are no different. They are a terrorist group. They meet the definition just as much as Al Qaeda, Al Shabaab. Now, as far as violence goes, okay, maybe you could argue some other terrorist organizations at this point have been more violent. But the concern is that mentality. It's what we call like a criminal mentality. My concern is if you have somebody who's open to using terrorism and open to fascism and open to getting rid of the checks and balances in government, having one party rule with a dictator at the top, this is a very dangerous situation. So yes, they fall under the definitions just the same as any other terrorist organizations, if you look at the definition of what they have done and are doing. Now, is that to say, and this is why I get some pushback and I understand it, I am not saying that everyone who votes Republican is a terrorist. I am not saying that. But the problem is if you vote for Donald Trump, you are voting for MAGA, and MAGA is a terrorist organization in what they're doing, in my opinion. So if that is your presidential nominee and you vote for him, that's what you're supporting. It's pretty straightforward. I mean, if I have a nominee who says I'm going to put diehard Christian values into law, or Islamic views, or Hindu views, whatever, I'm going to be against that person because I'm like, wait a minute, I don't want to have to do those things. I don't want to pray 5 times a day. I don't want to have to go to church. I don't want to have to believe in all these different gods. Doesn't matter. So yes, the long answer is yes, they meet the definition of terrorism identically to the other terrorist groups.
Yeah. They've made the accusation that groups like Black Lives Matter should also be defined as a terrorist movement. What would your argument for that be?
So I actually had that argument. I went on a podcast, as I said, with someone who is definitely more conservative bent. And that was one of the questions they asked. And in all fairness, I don't think that's an unfair question. I don't really feel that's deflection. And the answer I gave, and I hope I did it well, is that, yeah, maybe some of them were engaged in activity that did have a terroristic intent. They did intend to create political change through illegal activity and harm. But now we get into a weird zone because now we're talking about, hey, it's a group of people who are wanting to, even if they are engaging in illegal activity, and I'm all for arresting anybody who's doing anything illegal, okay? But if peacefully they're saying, hey, we feel that law enforcement has wronged us and that we're not being represented as a community of color, and we want to step up and fight against that, that isn't terrorism, okay? That's standing up for your rights. Okay, now where it becomes terrorism, and this is where I'm kind of hedging my bet on that. Some of their activities could be considered terroristic, absolutely. And some of them could be considered terrorists if they're willing to engage in criminal activity that harms and intimidates and coerces others to get their political change through illegal means. That's the key difference there. So not everyone on MAGA or Black Lives Matter agrees with that. But I think the fundamental difference between those two groups is I think there's a large number of BLM supporters who do not support terrorism. They're like, hey, I want these goals met, but I'm not okay with going out and breaking a ton of laws and scaring people and threatening them and hurting them and killing them to get it. Okay, but the problem with MAGA is it is a large group that is okay with these criminal activities, and its supporters are okay with this criminal activity occurring. When you poll them, and over a third of them say, hey, I think it's great that our new president's going to be possibly be a convicted felon. That's a plus. Okay. And then you have an extremely large number say, oh, it doesn't matter either way to me. I'll still vote the same. This is where it's more scary, because we're talking about BLM is a much smaller movement than MAGA, and BLM isn't attempting to take over the United States government, where MAGA clearly is. I mean, they've said so. So the difference between the two is BLM isn't really a direct threat to overthrowing our government and changing our democracy forever into a fascist movement. In fact, Antifa stands for anti-fascism. So the whole argument that they're, big time trying to create fascism doesn't match even their own term. They're against fascism. So yes, what we need to look at is all terrorism is criminal, but not all crimes are terrorism. So to say, is BLM a terrorist movement the same way MAGA is, I'm not well versed in it enough, to be honest. If I did more research on it, maybe I could say the whole group. But the way it looks from what I've seen so far, without having done more research on it, it seems like there's a small part of BLM that is okay with terroristic activity to get what they want. I think a much larger part of that group is not okay with it. They want it done peacefully. They want it done the right way. They want to make sure their rights are protected. And, I understand where they're coming from. There's definitely been some negative publicity of some things that have happened with police. Now, that being said, I've worked with them, even with the situation we're having with MAGA. The vast majority of men and women in law enforcement and the military are doing good jobs. Okay. And they genuinely care about protecting people. But the scary part is, with that mindset, the ones who are malleable to having that mentality change with just a simple change in law is a bit scary, because many of them will be like, hey, if you're doing conservative things I like and you make a law, I'll go ahead and enforce it. So, but yeah, I don't think BLM is in the same category as MAGA, no.
How do you view MAGA's actions and rhetoric? What are the direct threats that you envision, that you see to our American democracy?
Well, I think the biggest threats to our American democracy at this point is that one-party rule with a powerful president in charge. If they can achieve that, that is fascism. I don't think he cares about being called a dictator. And if you look, President Putin, okay, he's the president. Well, he's also a dictator. So my concern is that that's the direction that they're going to go as far as directly. And the other problem is the checks and balances, like we're seeing now. We've always had an imperfect system. There's always been a little bit of back and forth with people pushing the limits of what they could do. But this is the first time we've seen a presidency over the course of 4 years doing everything it can to consolidate power in the presidency and into one party. Okay. And we've seen that. And I would think that even if someone who is pro-MAGA, who's listening right now, I would love to hear that comment coming in if you disagreed. Is that not a goal of MAGA, is to have your party in control and to have President Trump be the leader and to give him and your party more power? From all the ones I've talked to, they've said yes. So as a group, MAGA does want that control. So our direct threat is that attack on government and getting control of government, to where we have one party rule with a dictator top, where we have checks and balances being destroyed. And we're already seeing that constitutional protections, constitutional amendments are being attacked, and damaged or destroyed. Okay, so that's just going to continue. And that's, I think, the scary part as far as their direct attack. Indirect attacks, I would say that has far more to do with people who support them. And I definitely don't put them in the same category. Okay, not at all. Okay, but unfortunately, if I was voting and it was Democrats and the person in charge did the same things, I would know that my vote was going towards fascism. My vote was going towards breaking down the protections, the systems of checks and balances in the government, our constitutional protections, and our liberties. So I wouldn't vote for that person. So that's the scary part to me, is that a lot of people be like, well, the Republican conservative goals are more important to me than the Democratic goals, so I'm going to vote that way. Well, once you start getting the fascist component and the destruction of our current liberal democracy in place, that no longer is just a Republican versus Democrat thing. It's now, do you want to protect the Constitution of the United States and protect our freedoms, or do you want to destroy them? That's the way I look at it. And I think it's a realistic way of looking at it. So my hope is that they'll somehow find a way for him not to be the nominee, and they'll get a much better Republican in there to support their true Republican values instead of the MAGA ones, which are an antithesis to what the Republican Party claims.
But at this point, though, can we actually say that?
As far as being antithesis, or getting someone in besides Trump to be the nominee?
Well, as far as saying the antithesis.
Yes, because the Republican parties, the takeaway I get from their party is one of their biggest priorities is the support of law and order. Okay. And yet we have a party, MAGA, who's in control of the Republican Party at this point, or at least is driving it through those means. Okay. So, and we've seen that, because you see like what happened with the impeachment, where they voted not to impeach, not because they didn't think he did it, but because it was in their best interest to. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about, where that terrorism has pushed into the government as well. Okay. And we've seen that. So that's kind of where I'm going at with my concern with them, is that attack in that way.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that I think is fair. It's just, the 90 plus 91 indictments, it's changed now, I believe. Has that maybe backfired to the point where it does seem like an attack on Trump with all of these different court cases? I'm not making the argument that these are not just valid cases. I'm saying the appearance of these cases, does that not speak to Donald Trump's rhetoric and what he's telling his people? Like, hey, look, I'm being persecuted, I'm being prosecuted. This is a political war directed at me and the movement. Does the fact that we have this, does that not help though to sort of cement in their minds that, well, yeah, this does look like it's an extreme piling on, and so therefore, yeah, he is being politically attacked. So technically, we're not breaking any laws, or we're not, as you just said, we're not contradicting the values that we espouse.
Yeah, one of the issues with that, because I've heard that before, is when you have a group of people who, when you talk to them, you say, hey, you're trying to create a fascist government, you're engaged in activities that meet the definition and intent of terrorism, and you're pushing towards a fascist controlled party that's going to take away freedoms, even if they're taking away the freedoms that you don't want. Okay, they're taking away the freedom to be gay, they're taking away the freedom of whatever your group goes against. They don't mind that. Okay. So, and they only listen generally to right-wing media and not left-wing media. So the problem when you have somebody who is, for lack of a better word, a cultist, who is dedicated to that group and only listens to the information that comes from the group or people that support the group, they don't get that outside perspective. The difference is when you look at this as a politically motivated attack and you say, okay, this is politically driven. Okay. I understand where they're coming from, but look at the charges. Okay. These aren't, you can't trump up fraud charges. You can't trump up classified document charges. You can't trump up charges on doing an insurrection. These are things you can't trump up. And I guess I shouldn't use that term, but they have to be proven in a court of law, and no prosecutor is even going to bring forward that charge unless there's like I said before, an overwhelming amount of evidence showing guilt, which means all elements of the crime have been met and this person did it. When you see 91 different felonies like that, we're not talking about a politically charged attack. Okay, we're talking about going after a criminal. And a lot of people that I've talked with have said, well, why now? Well, they can't investigate a sitting president. So for 4 years, by their own DOJ policy, they couldn't investigate him. So after he gets out of office, they start investigating. And then they build up enough. And then we saw what happened. Now they're being charged. And now we have Supreme Court justices pushing it off to pass the election. Okay, we have his own legal group that's very efficient, okay, at obscuring information, at delaying, peeling, all these tactics to try to push it past the election. So when people say it's a political attack, my answer is always, who cares? Okay. If I'm a Democrat and the Republicans find out I committed a felony, by all means, call the police, get me arrested. Okay. My problem is that should always happen. Okay. No matter who you are. If, I was law enforcement, I'm a citizen now and I want to be defended. I want my rights defended and I want people obeying the law. And if we have people out there who are committing felonies, I want the police to go after them. That's plain and simple. So when people say, well, it's a politically motivated, well, who cares if it's politically motivated? Did he commit a felony? If he did, charge him. And if he gets convicted, put him in jail. And that doesn't matter who it is. I heard the same thing with Hillary Clinton, and even now they were saying, well, what about Hillary Clinton? I'm like, well, she hasn't been charged with 91 felonies. You got to find one first, guys, so, that's my thing is you definitely, when people say it's politically motivated, that's just, it doesn't hold water. It doesn't make sense. This isn't political.
One thing that for instance, along that argument, and again, as you say, that perhaps this doesn't matter, but one of the examples will be, well, why the fraud case against Trump? He simply does what every other real estate in developer in New York, and other states for that matter, do all the time. They overvalue their assets, and in that case, the bank said that they actually came out ahead, that they wanted to do business with Trump again. So therefore, yes, why now? But why now? Because it's specifically politically driven.
Well, in my opinion, one of the things I thought was funny was he said during the trial, he said, that this is election interference. And I'd be like, yeah, that's what the trial's about. His election interference. Okay. So under campaign finance laws, what he's in trouble for is not paying the hush money payment. It is not making those payments. What he's in trouble for is hiding it and using machinations so that the public didn't know about it until after the election. And one of the things that I think is going to help the jury lean towards a guilty, and I have no idea if they'll guilty or innocent on this. I'm not there to look at the information. But one of the things I think is going to help them go down that road is when they realize and they say, wait a minute, in these conversations, he didn't say, make sure this goes away. I don't want Melania divorcing me. He's saying, make sure it goes away until after the election. So that's where it became a felonies versus misdemeanors. And like you were saying, yes, many businesses have inflated or deflated their assets. And to some extent, it's acceptable. To other extents, it's not. If you have a decades-long operation where you're grotesquely inflating it when it's in your best interest and deflating it when it isn't, yeah, you're going to run afoul of the law. Okay, so, it's one difference, like tax avoidance versus tax evasion. Tax avoidance is patriotic. You want to avoid paying taxes you don't have to pay legally. Tax evasion is illegal. Same thing with him. Okay, we're not talking about, hey, I overvalued it by $100. We're talking about, in some cases, like what they were saying in the news, double, tripling, quadrupling or more of an asset, or doing the opposite to devalue it when it comes time to pay things like insurance. And yeah, if you do that openly and willfully, that's a violation. Now, one of the nice things about a corporation, I wouldn't say nice, what you were talking about earlier, corporations enjoy the protections of being a person with none of the liabilities. Like you hear these corporations like, oh, if this corporation has been charged with a felony, okay, well, are they in prison? No, they got a fine, which was way less than what they made. But when it comes to individuals, yes, it becomes criminal. So if he engaged in those activities, which looks likely, yeah, they'll probably go down that road. But I think that's where really the issue is he wasn't doing it to try to avoid embarrassment or, protect his marriage. From what we're seeing, and again, my opinion, from what we are seeing, it was to affect the election. And that's where he ran afoul of the law.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree with that, that position. It just, I guess where I was going with that is that the appearance that Trump is able to manipulate his favor by saying, look at this, all these different states and all these different charges across all these different areas. It does show, and it's almost like he's able to use all of this stuff, this bad stuff, and somehow manipulate it into a way that makes him look beneficial, and to something that does in fact give him a tremendous political benefit at this point. How do we overcome that perception?
That's one of the problems that we have right now is when it comes to the for lack of a better way of putting it, true believer or cultist side of it, you can't. I've had many, many conversations with people who are pro-MAGA. I have yet to ever convince one of them that what MAGA was doing was wrong. And in many cases, they're getting information that is verifiably untrue. I mean, not just exaggerated, but just completely wrong. I had one. I mean, we saw one in the news. I can't remember. I think it was Laura. I think it was the person in charge, his daughter, who was in charge of the RNC, and she was saying, "Well, how if we only have this many registered voters, and 70 and 80 million, 74 million voted for Trump, then the numbers don't match." Well, the number she gave was a complete lie. I mean, it wasn't even close. It was, I can't remember, like 170 million or something like that, registered voters, when in reality, there's way more registered voters than that. So that's the problem we're running into, is if somebody comes to you with something they're saying and saying, well, hey, how come we have 100 million immigrants in this country who are here and undocumented and illegal? And I'd be like, 1 out of 3 people is not an undocumented illegal immigrant. And they'd be like, what? Be like, do the numbers, So that's one of the things that we're going to have a problem with, is I don't think we can bring back many of the people who are true believers, because they are unwilling to see outside of their group, their cult, their tribe. So even the ones that are willing to aren't allowed to say it, because you'll be excommunicated, like I was. As soon as I started speaking up against them, I was immediately kind of cast out, which was okay, because I'm in law enforcement to be a good law enforcement officer, not to be popular. So, and there were many others like me who were there as well. So before the public gets scared that like I'm an anomaly, no, unfortunately we're a minority, but I'm not the only one. There's others who also stood up and are standing up today, and I applaud them. But yeah, that's the short answer. So I don't think you can't really change someone who's closed-minded. If they're open-minded enough to look outside of their right-wing media sources and consider what we have to say, that's a person who either wouldn't have been hoodwinked by MAGA to begin with, or somebody who's very quickly going to go, oh, you know what? Yeah, that was a mistake. And there are some people like that. There's even some books out that have been written where people have said, wow, I was in the MAGA tribe and I did not realize until I opened my mind up that what I was being, fed a bunch of lies. And that's really the biggest travesty in this is what scares me is not Donald Trump. What scares me is the millions of people supporting Donald Trump, especially in positions of power. That's what scares me. Nobody rose to power on their own. Nobody. They all had lots of people behind them, and that's why this is such a scary movement. And if it was a majority of the population, I would be devastated, but at least I would understand it. But it's not. It's a significant group, but it is a minority. It is not the majority of people that want them in power.
Well, no, I think I agree with that. But getting these numbers even is very difficult.
Yes.
In this political polarization that we have in this country right now. And I think that's where, again, we're making a lot of assumptions. I mean, we're assuming that the majority of those in the military, which is traditionally a right-wing conservative leaning majority, historically at least, well, not maybe going, you know what I mean?
I do. Yeah, I think they're very similar to law enforcement. But I was National Guard, and I stopped regular duty with National Guard and went to an active reserve at the end of, I think, 1994. So I can't speak for the military now, but from what I saw back then, it was very similar to the mindset and culture of law enforcement. So it would not surprise me that they have a very similar number issue as far as people who support or acquiesce to the MAGA movement.
Right. And so it's possible that, a lot of this, again, is, well, how many people in law enforcement, part of the problem, too, is whether or not you're going to get something that's an honest answer, depending upon how you do the methodology of the study. And being very interested in sociology, this is sort of a fascinating area for me. We're not in a position really to have a lot of factual data that we can actually count to as far as institutional power is concerned, as far as, well, how far is this to the right that maybe we didn't realize? And has this been again, Trump didn't just sort of emerge on his own. I think he took advantage of the political situation that existed, the economic situation that existed, because a lot of what Donald says, strangely, is true in that there are systemic injustices that are occurring. I mean, there's economic injustices. when he spoke to that pain, that ability to reach out, because again, I mean, if you look at the majority of his supporters, the people showing up to, I mean, they're poor. I mean, they're economically disadvantaged in many ways. And so he was able to speak to that pain. And he's been able to, and of course, has he done anything to help those people? No, not in the least. Is he going to? Not in the least. I mean, he is simply about himself and that's it. But he's able to give voice to a lot of pain that people are feeling. And
Absolutely.
because of that pain, is there not a position of credibility that he has sort of written on that everyone else is against you except for me? I'm the one that's fighting for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of the whole flag thing too is pseudo-patriotism. That's one of my concerns is a lot of people I've run into in MAGA, at least in the law enforcement side of it, are patriotic. They, in their mind, I call it pseudo-patriotism, but they feel they're patriotic and they feel that they're being good Americans and that Donald Trump is supporting those values. But when you show them objectively that that's not the case, even if you call MAGA Make America Great Again, it's not. Okay, it's Make America Fascist Again. Okay, and that's not a patriotic goal. If you are a true American, then you are for liberty and justice for all, indivisible, which means no secession, guys. Okay, there's a whole bunch of things in there that when you listen to them, and like the constitutions that he's handing out with the Bible, well, hell, read either one of them. Pardon my French. Neither one of them espouses what he's talking about. If you look at anything besides really hard right reactionary Christian movements, if you look at Christian movements from most Christians, most Muslims, okay, they don't want warfare. They don't want terrorism. Okay, they want to live their lives. They want to be able to enjoy their religion, and maybe they can even convert some other people to it because they believe in it. But they aren't actively trying to force it on anybody. So the problem we have with these employees that are pseudo-patriots is they're saying, I am a patriotic, good person, and what he's doing is good for America. But then when you show them that the actions that are occurring are anti-American, they go against the Constitution, they go against the law, they go against freedom for all, they just look at you blankly and blink their eyes and say, that's not true. They're not willing to listen to information you give them that refutes what they say. And like I discussed many times before, it's that effect of pseudo-patriotism, tribalism, and co-opting of organizations like law enforcement to where even if you don't believe, you better toe the line and go with it. Otherwise, you're going to be ostracized. And that's not, we depend on each other. And the last thing most of us want is to be looked at as a pariah, especially in something like the military and law enforcement, where that person can make the difference between survival and not survival in your case. So it's a really scary position to be in when you have a majority of people who either are pro-MAGA or acquiesce to being pro-MAGA. It makes for a very dangerous environment. So that's what makes this movement so dangerous is the millions of people behind it and the machinations, for lack of a better word, that they're doing to try to make it look like it's a patriotic movement, when in fact it is not. It's anti-patriotic.
If we're going to agree, okay, this is in fact a terrorist movement. Beyond naming it, what should we be doing? What should law enforcement be doing right now? What should the courts be doing right now? And this goes way beyond just Donald Trump. I mean, if we're going to say that there's a group of people that we're going to classify as terrorists, what then should we be doing?
Well, therein lies the problem. With foreign terrorist organizations, once they're designated a terrorist organization, then you have kind of a broad brush to go after them as far as material support of terrorism. Anything up to trying to travel to train, trying to give them money, actively being involved with any of the processes of doing an attack or supporting an attack or even funding can be a criminal charge and go after them. The problem is by not having that designation, they're gone after as individuals or individuals in a group, and that's much harder. So the biggest thing we have to do is call them out for their illegal activity and make sure law enforcement does do their job of going in and, if appropriate, arresting them or dispersing them or whatever they're supposed to do. Those are the critical things as citizens we need to do is say, hey, look, this criminal activity is happening, and call the police. And this is not even just MAGA. This is just for our society. When we see a criminal act, call and say, hey, 911, this is what's happening. And you give the information, including your testimony in court if necessary. Okay. And the law enforcement should show up and pursue any criminal activity. Okay. So that I think is the most critical thing we can do. And the other thing, of course, is holding people accountable and trying to get the word out. I don't think we're going to have much luck with getting converts to our cause to leave MAGA and see the light. But what we can do is get a lot of people out there. We won last time 81 million to 74 million and kept him from getting the presidency. It was the most number of people who had voted for either party. So hopefully that will still happen, but it is an ongoing process. Fighting for liberty and fighting for democracy and fighting against tyranny is something we've had to do ever since this country started. So it's becoming even more critical today. So my answer for the average person out there is make other people aware of the problem, call out any illegal activity that MAGA or anyone is doing, and hold your law enforcement, your government accountable. If they're not doing what they're supposed to do, call them out on it. Okay. And vote, definitely. And I hate to say it, but vote against Donald Trump and MAGA would be my answer. Obviously, as I say many, many times, voting is your right. And many people have fought and died for that right. And you can vote however you want. Okay. But I do want people to really take a hard look at what that vote's going to mean. And if you're voting for a guy who openly supports a group that engages in and supports terrorism, that's not somebody you want as president.
What role do you think social media plays in the spread and this reinforcement of the MAGA ideology?
Oh, it's huge. One of the problems is I had this discussion before about just talking about news and journalism. One of the problems that I see with it that I'd like to see brought back is there's been this degradation in journalistic integrity, not so much by the journalists themselves, but like I said, the news agencies that hire them. And the problem we're running into is people are now allowed to say outlandish things that are demonstrably false. And other people jump on and run with it as though it were true. And we're seeing that a lot with groups like MAGA, where they're saying and using information that just isn't correct. And when you look at that and say, well, hold on a second, what you're saying isn't true, they immediately say, oh, no, you're just a liberal, you're woke, and you're like, no, I'm just questioning the validity of your information, just like you shared with me. If somebody comes up to me and says, hey, Russ, there's something you found out and those numbers are actually not correct. They're actually these numbers. Okay. I'm okay with that. I can say, okay, I didn't realize that. Where I got the information from that was fact checked, said at this time, this was the information. Okay. Part of learning and part of growing is learning new things. But the problem we're running into with social media is nowadays it's so pervasive in everyone's lives that it can make and break careers. So it's very concerning that information can get out there that isn't fact checked. And since we have a situation now where your average person can, get on Facebook or Instagram and say whatever they want, and there isn't something in place to fact check them. And that's what should be there is I don't mind their viewpoints. I mean, you can say the most radical, crazy viewpoint you want, but make sure what you're saying is accurate.
Right.
And that's what I'm saying. That's why I try to say, and not just from a legal perspective, but I also like to try to tell people, hey, here's where I'm saying my opinion. And here's where, hey, my opinion is supported by facts, or here are the facts, and it isn't an opinion. Those are the kind of conversations we need to have as citizens, as Americans, as people in this world, is open communication about the real factual things that exist and have happened. And that's where we run into that problem is that, when you get groups with fanatics, they're willing to not only accept false information, but help spread it to their fellow fanatics. So, we have millions of people believing in things that are just patently untrue.
I want to get to your book again. And if we can go ahead and actually put a picture of the book up.
You got it.
Yeah, I think we have it. Pretty sure we have it.
Yep, that's it. Thank you.
Here we go. Is MAGA a terrorist movement? Russell K. Jack. And can we also put the banner up? Can we do that at the same time where people can go to purchase the book and learn more about it? There we go. MAGAterrorism.com. Ladies and gentlemen out there in Radio Land, MAGAterrorism.com. And again, the book is MAGA, a Terrorist Movement. And I found this book to be fascinating. It's a very easy read. There's a lot of source citations to back up everything that's being said. And Russell goes through great lengths to delineate and make clear who is talking about and who is not talking about. I understand why you put the book out. Why did you think that it was necessary to have a book that spoke from the perspective of someone who is formerly in law enforcement specifically?
Well, the biggest reason is because I think a lot of people have had contacts, obviously, with law enforcement, but I don't think a lot of people realize just how pervasive the MAGA movement is in the law enforcement and government communities. I would imagine also with the military, it's an issue as well. So one of the things I wanted to bring forth is that this is a firsthand experience that I had, especially during my last 6 years as a federal air marshal, working with other people whose job is counterterrorism. That's what air marshals do. And to be working with a group of people who support an organization that uses terrorism or the methods of terrorism and uses and condones illegal activity goes very much against what law enforcement is supposed to be doing. For me, it was very personal in that the most, I don't want to say most important, but one of the biggest things about being in the government and being in law enforcement is that oath you took to protect your country against all enemies, foreign and domestic, same as with the military. Okay, but you're also there to defend people's rights, all people, not pick and choose what laws you want to enforce, not pick and choose what people you want to apply it to, but to defend everyone's freedoms and to protect everyone. And when I see a large group of people in the government who don't have that commitment and in fact work against that commitment, that's very disturbing. And that's something I didn't see a lot of until the last 6 years. And then I saw it very openly. And that was my biggest concern is when that happened, I said, wait a minute, if they're coming out and openly violating, their sworn oath to protect people from crime and terrorism, well, what's going to happen if MAGA comes into power? Are they going to fight against it or are they going to help support it? And the answer is they're going to help support it, especially if it's law. I mean, once they pass a law and you're a law enforcement officer, you'll be like, okay, it's the law. Okay. Those aren't the kind of people who are going to be like, oh, there's a law that says that if you have a book that's LGBTQ, that it has to be burned, or if you own it, you go to jail. They'll support it. Okay, so that's my concern with the MAGA thing. So the reason I came forward was because for 6 years especially, I saw people who openly supported MAGA through their behaviors, through insignia, and even just openly saying it. And I think the public isn't aware of just how large of a problem it is. I mean, they're aware that there's, police and military who believe that, but I don't think they realize just how much MAGA has co-opted those systems through pseudo-patriotism and tribalism. And that's what I want to make people aware of is, yes, it's a threat. Yes, it's pervasive in the government. And it's also a huge problem what they're attempting to accomplish. And if we don't actively try to resist and stop them from accomplishing it, they will. Their people are very motivated. In fact, many of them are fanatical to get what they want. So there's somebody we have to actively work against, just as we did with Al Qaeda or Al Shabaab or Hamas. We have to work against groups that are against America's best interest, especially against our citizenry.
Right. You also think that is this a fair statement to make that the MAGA movement simply exploits the economic and social grievances that people have to gain so much support?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that is part of the draw. I mean, if you've looked at fascist movements in the past, and again, I know cliche, but you look back to, World War II in Germany, and even look to the Taliban in Afghanistan. Okay. They were laughed at. I mean, when you look at Hitler, you look at the Taliban, they were a joke. People are like, oh my God, look at these crazy people. Next thing you know, they're in charge of the country. Okay. That's the danger. The danger is when people are openly supporting it and it's going in their best interest. This is the scary part to me, like you were touching on, is he has some very real points. And if I'm from a community where I'm like, hey, I don't feel I'm being well represented, and somebody comes along who's a cult of personality and says, hey, I've got your back. The coal mines have been, unfairly hit because people are concerned about pollution and, poisoned water and air. Okay. And they want to switch to better sources. Well, no, they're just after your jobs. And so that person is going to resonate with me if I'm that person who works in coal. And I'm going to say, I'm not using that as an example. Okay. I'm not against people who work in coal. Okay. But I'm just saying, if I'm in an industry where just because of progress, it's going away, or because it's in the best interest of the health of the average American, instead of retraining and moving on to a different field, okay, they're like, I've been disadvantaged and this guy is going to take care of me. So I can see the pull. I can see why that happened. And if you look back at Germany and what happened then, Okay, same kind of thing. They're like, hey, you've been disadvantaged. I'll take care of you. We'll go after this other group. Okay, and they're the ones who are the problem, and we'll go after them. And then your life will be great. They're the problem. Okay, that's kind of what these cult of personalities and these fascist movements do, is they turn us against each other. They say, hey, if you're not pro-MAGA, you're anti-American. And that's basically what they say. And that's what I'm here to refute. No, if you're American, you are anti-MAGA. I mean, there is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. If you believe in what America stands for, freedom for all, our Constitution, our liberal democracy, our checks and balances in government, then by default, you have to be against MAGA. So, but I understand the appeal. I get it. And that's where he gets his base from. That's where he gets a lot of these people. So you're right, unfortunately.
Finally, what message would you like to leave with those that are still supporting MAGA, knowingly or unknowingly supporting extremism?
Well, one thing I found interesting is I've gotten a lot more book reviews, and I noticed that the majority fall either into 5-star or 1-star. And yeah, exactly. And I'm all for, a fair review. If you're like, hey, I liked your book. Okay, here's 3 or 4 stars. Okay, great. But one thing I noticed too is in reviews, when people are giving their explanations, one thing that I am actually happy about is when the 1-star ones come in, they're like, you have TDS, Trump derangement syndrome. Well, in my book, I talk about how that term by itself is nonsensical. Okay. It's you don't have regard for the things that his administration has done. And I'm trying to remember the other term that was in there besides regard. And you have a negative opinion of Donald Trump. Okay. Well, there's a reason that we're concerned about what's going on. We very much are paying attention to and care what's happening. So the whole idea that we have some sort of derangement because we're against the things he's doing, that's not derangement. That's just being smart. So I would actually ask people who are against my book, people who are pro-MAGA and feel that I'm just a woke leftist person, which is not completely true. Okay. But yes, I am for everyone's rights. Okay. Everyone's freedoms. Okay. But when you go in there and look at those reviews, none of those 1-star reviews had any factual data saying I was wrong, saying, hey, here's something you said. Here's how it's incorrect. Here's the facts that support that it's incorrect. None of them. So my open invitation to anyone who's pro-MAGA is take a hard look at if you're a patriot, which is what MAGA says you are. MAGA says, I'm very patriotic. Look at what being a patriot means. Read what the oath of office is if it applies to you and you're a government employee. Read the Constitution. Really read it. Okay. Read that Pledge of Allegiance and what those words actually say. Okay. And look into those constitutional amendments on things like the 12th Amendment, the First Amendment, and say, wait a minute, are some of the things we're doing violating these things? And they are. Okay. So you can push for your agenda. You can push for conservatism over liberalism. You can push for Republican over Democrat. But when you push for, I want to destroy the foundations of America and put a fascist party in charge, yeah, now there's a problem.
Right. I want to thank you for joining us today. And I apologize. I took some cold medicine, and so I've been very loopy and brain fog throughout this whole thing. I'm so sorry about that. But again, thank you so much for coming on the show. And please, MAGAterrorism.com, buy the book. And again, I want to thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks, Sean. I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll see you in, believe, 2 weeks.
Got it.
Stay tuned, because Citizens Talk Radio will be right back with more hope for a better world.